For example, you have a bank and you have guards in the bank, and the question is, how many guards do you need so that the bank doesn't get robbed? And then you say, well, it's never been robbed before, so I need no guards. But then if you remove the guards, people would change their incentives. We'll see it's a bit different, and then they can go and rob the bank.
Welcome to the Knowledge Archives podcast. We're a group of students on a mission to learn from as many different disciplines of knowledge as possible. I'm your host, Madhav Malhotra, and today I'm lucky to be joined by Dr. Maria del Rio-Chanona, a Postdoctoral Fellow at the Complexity Science Hub in Vienna, Austria. Her research focuses on studying economics with data-driven models, like studying the impact of COVID-19 on different industries in the UK. I really appreciate you taking the time for this conversation. And to start off, I'd really love to hear a little bit about you, what you're working on right now, and how you got started with this area of work.
Sure. Well, thank you for the time, Madhav. It's very kind of you to record this podcast. Actually, as of today, I finished my PhD in Oxford. So my PhD is in mathematics. I did my undergrad in physics, but I spent most of my PhD doing economics. And I do that in the Institute for New Economic Thinking here at Oxford, in the group supervised by Dawn Farmer. And we try to take a more interdisciplinary approach to economics that's, data-driven, and we focus on modeling and a lot of computer simulations. And I will be continuing doing research. I'll be at the Complexity Science Hub in Vienna. So it's a new center for complex systems, and I'm very excited about it.
Yeah, we actually talked to another mathematician who was working with complex systems, and he was focusing on network analysis. And I think he was also based in Germany or Austria, so that's really cool to hear. And you are definitely working on many different intersections there. Could you tell us a little bit, in terms of historical context? So if we think about data-driven economics, what kind of things are we talking about throughout history? How did this discipline get started?
Right. Well, talking about data-driven economics is mostly talking about economics since data started, right? So it's not that implementing data is a new thing in economics. It's been there for a long while. Since we've wanted to incorporate data into it. I'm going to talk more about macroeconomics, and of course, giving a full history is complicated, but perhaps a glimpse of it would be, GDP. There's this book by Diane Cole that I recommend about the history of GDP. Since the mid-1600s, you have William Petty trying to come up with a measure of productivity and population, basically to know how much you could tax people to finance war. There's also, unemployment that has been registered for labor unions. So yeah, perhaps one particular example of data is in the labor market. So in the mid-90s, we had an unemployment track records from either labor unions, or also there was in the UK initial of labor insurance, right? So with that, you can track unemployment. And then they started tracking vacancies. The way they did it is the UK had these labor exchanges where people would post vacancies and they would get filled. So with that, we came up with the Beveridge curve in that time, which basically says when there's more vacancies, there's less unemployment. And when there's more unemployment, there's less vacancies, right? There was also a shift a bit, now getting serious about more economic variables and where data started being more of a thing. You have Timbergren in the mid-late 1900s. So Timbergren wanted to describe the economy with equations and added some error factors. So that's basically, he's one of the founding fathers of econometrics, which was basically, observing data and with that inferring some equations, some statistical models, and saying what will happen in the future.
Yeah, that's a really cool application of how, even to this day, we still use that kind of data-driven economics. But for your work, I assume you are doing a different type of data-driven economics?
So then we have in the 1970s, there's the Lucas critique. The Lucas critique basically says you can't predict the future based only on the past when you take into account policy changes. So what they basically say is when you make a policy, you influence how agents act. So they might not act as they did before. For example, you have a bank and you have guards in the bank, and the question is, how many guards do you need so that the bank doesn't get robbed? And then you say, well, it's never been robbed before, so I need no guards. But then if you remove the guards, people would change their incentives. We'll see it's a bit different, and then they can go and rob the bank. So that actually was a paradigm shift in economics, and people started being a bit more theory or model driven. And the way it started is economics is a lot about equilibrium. And in a way, equilibrium is demand equals supply. So they said, well, let's have these models, but let's make sure the models have equilibrium in them. And the models say, well, now you have rational agents that say, oh, there's this new policy, so I'm going to update my forecast, I'm going to update my expectations and act according to them, which, it's quite smart, though I would say they took it a bit to the extreme, in the sense that now when many models, which are, what you now would call DSG models, dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, then it's, agents that are, let's say, really smart, and they solve this optimizing equations, and they make decisions based on, maximizing the utility and knowing how the economy is going to work, or having a forecast that on average would be the right thing. So, that's a bit what I'd say. At the moment, you have econometrics or bars, that's more, estimating equations. And then you have this other types of models that are more DSGs that are, you assume equilibrium with some constraints, but it's very constrained by these assumptions. They do use data as well, but it's basically model first.
And so your work fits more into this second type of model?
So we think, and some people have before, that there's something in the middle, somewhere where you can have modeling assumptions, how, agents change their behavior, and also be data driven. So calibrate the model with the data. So one of the women who was a really good economist was Barbara Bergman. And this was in the 1970s, 1980s. She has a paper basically describing a simulated economy. She has it on Fortran, and it's, around 1,000 workers, a few firms. And one of the things she says is like, the workers here and the firms are not optimizing these huge utility functions. They're just acting on thumb rules, right? So saying, things what we think are more how people behave. After that, you have micro simulation and some models, and then you also start having agent-based models. So we say agent-based model when you have your agents and you have some behavior. And yeah, well, why not say it? During COVID, we developed an ABM that basically predicted in quite a good accuracy the drop in GDP for the UK. So yeah, in a nutshell, the idea is to have models that have the behavior of the agents, how we think work, but calibrated on a disaggregate level on data. So not only say, oh, this behaves as you think it would make sense, but have some validation.
I think we're going to have to break that down a little bit. So let me try and say back what I heard. So starting off with econometrics, it was really about go into the real world, collect some data, and then as you keep on collecting this data over time, then people started thinking, well, what if we could use mathematical equations or statistics to predict, what will change in the future? Would that be correct?
Yes, so not only what will change, but what would the effect of this policy be?
Yes. Okay. And then from there, we transitioned into more agent-based, modeling-based simulations, where the idea is like you're creating, let's say, I'm going to define agents as different components that each want X. So let's say you have a worker in your model that wants to earn as much money as possible. So that would be called the optimization objective, to earn as much money as possible. And economists then started to use these assumptions. Okay, if we have these different interacting parts of an economy, and each part is going to seek X goal, then we run the model. Everyone does what they're supposed to. And based on these rational assumptions, at some point, you'll have this end state. So in your example, you said the market supply equals demand, and you're modeling how do the components interact until they get to the theoretical, rational end state that we expect them to. Would that be correct?
Yes, and also a bit. So one thing is this all had been developed in parallel, right? So econometrics is still ongoing, dynamic stochastic DSG models are still ongoing, agent-based models is still ongoing, and they all, add different things to economics as a whole. And yes, the thing with DSG, or let's say completely theory-driven, was about having this rational expectation. So it's like saying, I assume that whatever happens, in the end, supply is going to equal demand, and we must be around that. And I shock it a bit, but I know that at the end it's going to converge to this equilibrium. And in a way, it's going to do it fast enough, so it's a good approximation to say the economy is at equilibrium. So that's, what that was a bit like the paradigm shift, like, having equilibrium as the basis of everything. Agent-based model goes a bit away of that. It's more like we start, we initialize, and we see where we go. We don't, assume that it's going to go to equilibrium and then see sort of where we're getting.
Yeah, that's really cool. So you briefly mentioned there that with your particular agent-based model, you were trying to see what would happen now that we have an enormous disruption to the economy with COVID-19. What would you say were like the general goals of the research? Why were you trying to do this modeling?
Right. Well, we were in a pandemic, and I still remember, I think it was around 15th of March last year, Doyne, our supervisor, sent an email and he was like, guys, this is going to be a big thing. We're going to, we need answers. We needed to have something that was data driven and something that we could observe how the economy would work, right? So the idea was like, let's try and see where we could help, right? Because one of the big hypotheses, and people imagine that is, well, poor people are going to suffer the most. And if you could give a concise argument of, well, first of all, is that true? So that's indeed is a research question. If it turns out it's yes, then the policy packages you need to help, the safety nets are different than if the answer is no. So, the goal was saying, let's try and see what's going to happen so we can help policymakers decide what to do, right? Or like, you put your research out there and you say, I think this is what's going to happen. It's now your turn to see how you can help people. So it was a bit of a horse race, and we tried to, scramble for data, see what we had. And, all of this was working done with the team, right? So we had Penny Melly, Francois Lafond, Anton Pitchler, Marco Bangallo, Doyne, and, several other of the INET team that also, helped in the discussion. And yeah, it was a team effort to try and do as best as we could with what we had.
So it's kind of like you were now in this position where you're trying to predict based on where we're at, like we're going to initialize our model to the current conditions, and now you're trying to predict what are the different places our economy could end up, so that you're able to generate insights on, which policies are needed to improve the worst case scenario.
Exactly. That was the purpose.
Okay, so you're making this agent-based model. Could you guide us through like the different agents, components in your model, and why it's important to model at the industry level?
Yes, I mean, I wouldn't say it's unique to us. Like even many DSG models take into account different firms. I think it's the way we put it together that makes it a bit more unique. So the first thing we realized is that different industries are going to have different shocks, right? Or, are going to be disrupted in different ways because, well, if you're maybe in a finance department, you can work from home. But, if you're in construction, that's not going to be the case. But maybe construction for some countries, it was considered essential. But if you're working in a restaurant, that's not the same thing. So the first thing we try to see is let's estimate the shocks, right? But you can't estimate the shocks. It wasn't an estimation that says we didn't say, well, we're going to wait for 2 months, see what happens, and then we estimate. What we did is we had a database that described work activities for different occupations that allowed us to see if they could work remotely or not. And we also based ourselves on the guidelines of Italy had a list of essential industries. So we took that to say, well, which industries are essential? So the first step was just computing the shocks, right? Like predicting what were going to be the shocks. And we had, I think our first preprint was around the 15th of April, so it was a month. And after that, it comes about like, okay, so that's the shocks, but how they're going to propagate, what's going to happen. And then what you have is you have industries, right? The basis of production is industries, and you also have households that consume. So an industry would, hire and fire workers depending on, in restaurants, they weren't demanding as much, so they would fire workers. The important thing about considering different industries is that you have a network structure in production, right? When you think about cheese, it's not like you don't have a cheese machine, right? What tends to happen is that you have farming, then oil and agriculture, that goes into farming, that goes into manufacturing, an industry, and then it arrives. So you have retail, so it's a supply chain that you can see as a network. And you can have supply chain disruptions, right? Because if someone is not able to provide your input, you cannot give that output. So that there comes the shock propagation. If an industry can't work, then that can propagate further down. And we have different types of shocks. One would be the supply shock, which means if you're making computers, all of a sudden you don't have the steel or the chips to make your computer. But it could be a demand shock if, for example, transport was not closed because it was considered essential, but people weren't traveling. So that would be a demand shock. And you'd have to understand this interconnectedness to see how it would work. And I think that's one of the things that modeled it pretty well, because we're able to understand that, shocks might propagate.
So if we could dive deeper into let's say, first of all, inputs and outputs of the process.
Yes, the model has many, many inputs. So the shocks are one of them. That's the disruption. But you also have, how many workers does a certain industry employ? Now, you would also have what you probably call a recipe for production, right? How do you make a car? You need tires, you need a steering wheel, you need seats, and you need an engine, right? So all of these things are provided by other industries. So that is this, recipes in a way are condensed in what we call the input-output network, right? Input-output, because exactly what's your input and what's your output. And when you talk about production, you'd say, well, what's the production function? What's the recipe? You have different inputs, which are goods in a way. So it'll be the engine, the tires, the steering wheel, and you also have labor. And you can be constrained because, you don't have enough engines to make cars. But you could also be constrained because you don't have enough workers to produce that car.
So now that you have these different inputs, so they're going through the production function to see how the outputs can be created by different industries. What would happen next now that you have initial conditions for each industry?
Well, first of all, there's differences in how you assume things are produced. So you can have what we would call a Leontief production function, which means, in the example of a car is you have 4 tires and 1 wheel. If you have 5 tires and 2 wheels, you can only produce 1 car, right? So you go for the minimum. The constraint is I only have enough tires to make 1 car. But you could also have substitution, which is more like cooking. You're out of one ingredient and you put another, right? You have some flexibility. What we did is, we tried several as a post-mortem analysis, but at the beginning what we did is distinguish between critical and important goods. And depending on this, we said there's some goods that you really can't produce if you don't have this. There's others that are, sort of important, but you can deal without it. They would affect production differently. Now, the big problem comes when you have a bottleneck. So when you're not able to supply to other industries, right? Because then that propagates, you shock one industry and, one industry that might have not been shocked at all of a sudden is shocked because they don't have the inputs to create their output. And that may cause another industry to fail in producing. So you have all these shocks propagating. And it depends a lot on the function you use. And, one of the innovations we did is categorize inputs into critical and non-critical so that we didn't have all the constraints of the Leontief, which said you just can't do a car, but we weren't as flexible, as, you can substitute almost everything for anything.
And I assume, do you have to go through each type of product produced in an economy to decide what's critical and not critical?
So we were very lucky that IHS Markit company had this survey So we could base ourselves. So they asked experts in production what's essential for each industry and what isn't.
Yeah, that's really cool. So if we could maybe look at this from like a little bit of the mathematical perspective, instead of, this is a tire, this is a engine, like let's see if the car can be made. It's like you have different numbers going into some kind of function, and then you have like another number as an output.
Yeah, so these are all parameters. It's input, which is like how you initialize the model, but you also have parameters, right? So for example, yeah, how fast can you fire a worker would be a parameter. Or how much do you shift your preference in consumption or a parameter. And all of this, so we don't solve the model with pen and paper, we simulate it, right? We code it, and then we have around 50 industries, and each industry is interconnected with every other industry. So you just code the assumptions and see how it behaves. And we calibrate it based on data, right? So like on the input output structure, we also had like inventory data, we had the employment data. It's a bit like engineering. You have all these pieces together and you have these gears and you have to like put them together to work.
Yeah. And one detail that I saw in your research paper was about how you were trying to predict, the first order shock effects, whereas it would be a lot more complicated to predict the propagated shocks. What did you mean by that? What are the complexities involved in the first order versus the propagated ones?
Yes. So we had two papers. The one was just estimating the first order shocks. And we said second order shocks will be dealt later. And that's what we did in the second paper, right? There's a lot of complications when you talk about shock propagation in networks. For example, one basic one is like you don't have enough inputs to produce your output, okay? But you still produce a certain amount. So you produce half of what people demand from you. How do you split that half? Do you give it all to one industry? Do you give it to like your biggest consumer? It turns out it matters a lot. So actually, Anton Pichler, one of the co-authors, did a next paper looking to that more into detail. And it turns out that, for example, if you do random or if you do rationing, it has a huge effect. So, depending on how large the shock is, one would have a better outcome than the other. So that's one example. Just the decision of how you make it basically says where you might expect a bottleneck. And we find these problems not only in supply in this input output networks. You find it, for banks, when you have a bank failure, you also have this network propagation, because it's not the same thing like, oh, this bank just lost this many assets. If a bank collapses, it will hit another bank, but it might hit another two banks. And if those two banks are connected, then there's a shock amplification. But and then another one, I particularly study the labor market, is when you talk about shocks in unemployment, right? So if an occupation all of a sudden it's affected, so there's some layoffs, they might go to another occupation to look for jobs. So that occupation, which was not originally shocked, might still be shocked. So there's a lot of complications in doing that, which is the reason we sort of, split this into different papers, because, as of them, they're quite big. So you sort of want to keep it clear.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about the input kind of data you used, how that is being affected throughout the model. What is the end output that you're trying to look at? Like, are you just seeing what is the condition of all the agents? What is the change in the variables we had at the beginning? And how do you know like what time to stop?
Right. Well, time is always complicated in these models. Here we run in time steps, so we could say it was a day, right? And you'd say, well, the shock lasted this much, right? So we actually did this according to the UK timeline, and we said lockdown would last this long, and that's sort of how you put the shocks. And so what's the output? Well, that's the blessing of this model. You output is whatever you want, right? We have aggregate GDP. That's how we compared our predictions. We had sectoral GDP, which we're also able to predict it, unemployment rate. So all of that you can see, and then it's important to see, well, which industries are being hit hardest, which workers are being hit hardest, which might help you say, well, then we should furlough here, we should support this industry. In a very good ABM, and if you had more time, you could even see how you can sort of rewire the input output network. to say, oh, if this industry starts supplying this other industry, it might help out. Distilleries start making hand sanitizer, for example. That would be a sort of a rewiring of the network, an adaptation.
Yeah, and we did see examples of that in real life. So I'm curious, like in the time frame that you did project your model, was that like up to this point? Like, can you now compare real life versus what happened in your model?
Yeah, so it's difficult because you have to recalibrate, right? You have to recalibrate what were at least in the UK, there's been a lot of lockdown, opening, reopening. Same for the US. There's been different policies, so you have to reevaluate and recalibrate. But yes, in principle, one could do that. So one of the reasons was at some point we're but we really need to couple this with epidemics, right, to see how it's going to work. So we're collaborating with the epidemiologists, and we're making a new model, one that considers that people get sick, and sort of trying to understand what would be the trade-off between economics and epidemics. It's a bit like, you sort of have to recalibrate it and see where you were wrong and go on. But yeah, in principle, that's, the dream is having, a lot of people working on this, and you have a model that you can keep on going. And, you'll have mistakes, you revisit, you can be a bit Bayesian always, right? Like you check your priors, you update them. That's what our aim is to develop agent-based models or models in general that are able to predict and are able to advise policy.
And I know you talked about, how many people of different specialties had to work on this together to make it happen. So it's really amazing to hear about all of the details around there. Moving forward, what do you think are some of the biggest areas for agent-based models to improve when, modeling these massive shocks?
One is initialization. One of the reasons it's useful to assume equilibrium is because you know the state of the economy. Oh, it's at equilibrium, supply equals demand, right? But when you don't assume that, you have to observe the economy. But now you don't observe every worker, right? At least not yet. So you have this macro variables that might be unemployment rate, maybe at the industry or at the occupation level, and you have to infer what's the real state. The other is calibration, right, which is more about parameters. So initialization is where is the economy. The calibration is, so if I push this button, what's the impact, right? So, how fast can you fire workers? What's that parameter? So both of those, initialization and calibration, are big ones. And then the other is just exploring model selection, right? Because we have different assumptions. Now, there's a huge area of economics called behavioral economics that's studying how people behave and stuff. So I think this area of economics is growing, and we definitely need more people. It's quite new, so we haven't had enough time to explore. But at some point, I also think that we'll be able to explore which mechanisms work better for the economy, which is a bit more, in a way, model selection. And once we know which gears are the good ones, then we can start moving forward. And then, of course, comes computational power. And, everything we do is open source, but there's some data that for privacy reasons you can't have. So all of this are future challenges.
Yeah. And when it comes to your work, finally, if people want to connect with you or follow your work, where might they go?
Email would be the best. I mean, I have a webpage. They can find me, Maria del Rio-Chanona. That would be the way to find me.
No, for sure. I'll make sure to link to your website, and I really appreciate you again walking us through, all of the enormous complexities of doing work like this.
Well, thank you for having the patience to go through them. And for every listener that have questions, I'd be happy to answer.